In the stories to follow, architecture will forego pursuing performance, and assume the role of connotative multi-perceptive experiential narrative. Therefore, architecture is to be thought of as the association of concept and form, whilst simultaneously invoking various processes of shaping spaces. Metaportals encompass a plethora of alternate universes on the threshold between fact and fiction, objective and subjective, primordial and post-apocalyptic, natural and aesthetic, rational and supernatural. Drawing on the elusive signifiers of ghostly structures, oblivious voids, palimpsestuous sites, geometries and traces of remote memories, fantastic situations and devious conditions, each entry heralds an experimental protocol where form and structure, idea and matter, morph into cinematic scripts and virtual prototypes. Transspatial narratives unfold into tripartite taxonomy is conveyed. O for organicum, M for machina, S for spectrum.
In a congested urban landscape, the personal is analyzed and transfigured through an imaginative process to expose an alternate reality. Protruding from a residential facade, a balcony enclosed with glass bridges the interior of the apartment with the outside city environment. This platform is a common familial space, yet narrow in proportion. It seems cluttered. Oriented inwards, a couch faces a television on one side, aligned with a desk for work on the other side, and bookshelves above, all too domestic. This mundane hall is decorated with numerous pots of plants in attempt to render the space green like a garden invading a loggia. It is this process that the imagery emphasizes. Out of these receptacles, trailing wood-stemmed plants are ejected. With this violent act of liberation, that whirling trunks and thick vines rupture the enclosure, expanding and growing in density to become a lush outclosure. Spurting out from the source yet leaching on, this densifying entity hovers over the streets below, like a flying shrub, animating the mineral surrounding. A new vantage point is affirmed, from secret terrestrial to secrete the Elysian.
Sheets of print paper, pens and pencils, water bottles, electronic cables, plastic wraps, gum packs and other miscellaneous articles, are tucked together in a translucent block that looks like blood soap. A section representing the constituents of this brick of wax is reminiscent of X-ray baggage scans, where incompatible and diverse objects are detected as a harmonic ensemble of shapes and colors. Following this logic, the mass is abstracted and inverted. This procedure exposes the negative space between these different items, now reduced to a series of velvety undulating surfaces, charged by interlocking appendices and spikes that pierce through these pieces and bind them together. These chiral entities are then flipped, manipulated and coupled. Adorned with a parasitic lattice structure, they become part of a biological combinatory system. The outwork mesh acts as a skin-enveloping scar tissue, allowing the multiple organizations to expand. Detailed views of the augmented incorporations suggest floating scattered lumps that one can only spur through, like bacteria.
In this architectural experiment, molten metal is transfixed by concentrated poured concrete. Sectioning through this block reveals crevices formed by clumps of fluid matter folded to a halt. Treated as fossils, these bits are extracted and categorized, only to be recollected. Repeating this process adds complexity to the agglomerations, giving order and purpose to happenstance. Reassembled, these bended ossifications are mounted together as self-standing structures with big spans of multi-level heights, interrupted by bridges or accentuated by large canopies. Traces of the operations persist, with the aggregates assigned similar textures, playing on the contrast of the initial materials. Internal views exhibit these confrontations, while views from the top uncover open fields of exploration. Bare and subdued, This regenerated rampant centipede with wings of magnetic foliage evolves into a spatial urban sculpture. Scaled and squirmed to fit in a coastal cityscape, this vision is framed as a rejection of types and typology in favor of framework. Disparate scraps coalesce in substance, consolidated into chromatic blocks that can be read as distinguished entities, or as sections from a bigger mass. A glossary of parts is exhibited, illustrating the characteristics of the scanned individual ingredients of this synthesis, or rather, the post-synthesis condition, of the now distorted, folded and cut pieces. Reedified without cohesive matter, like a protoplanetary formation, they unveil an amalgam of anti-gravitational spaces. This accretion of tori, bended planes and flying ribs form a nebula of reverie, manifesting possible speculations of hyperfuturistic space vessels. Random day-to-day things are shaped and fixed to form identical models presented like samples of loess. These igneous rocks are deducted and scrutinized, self-referential and abstract. The color inversion applied to these images transforms the cavities and graphic depressions into lit extrusions. When coplanar surfaces are rendered obsolete, only the differentiated and voluminous gain importance. These particularities are treated as curiosities, with their respective logics extracted and reused to confect new sibling forms similar in anatomy and texture. Solely, these artifacts are an ostentatious exercise of space-making. The bidimensional residues of blocks are distorted and given depth. Their uniform surface is now indented and topographic, adapted and able to receive these buildings together, forming a pristine landscape of radical contrast. Molded masses of collected things become drawings of dots that become lines and splatters, and vice versa. This approach is simultaneously retroactive and proactive, eliciting ideas of contextual architecture integration in cyclical time, from ashes to ashes, while promoting deregulated and free-formed terrains, from comic strip to cosmic trip.
Refugee camps, sheltering the displaced, populate the outskirts of cities. These urgent temporary settlements, formed by crude dwellings deprived of proper infrastructure, are problematic in nature. This project attempts to transform this bitter reality by means of isolation and inversion, reinterpreting the compound to expose a potentiality of insulation. A taxonomy of objects is layered over the silhouette of the hovels, such as electric poles, water tanks and other vital systems feeding into the existing island. Beneath this plateau, a graphic reflection of these complex relationships is translated, reformed, to produce a ludic panorama. Sandwiching a midline, these two conditions mirror each other, over and under, above and below, flipped in an alternate ideal. From ascetic to hedonistic, the grey becomes pink and despondency becomes amusement park.
Sketches of whirlpools twisting and twirling fibers and strands, become the reactionary imagery, translating public angst and need for protest. Exploring these confused movements of havoc, with a guerrilla attitude, vegetables are mounted and composed to form a centerpiece for riots. This rebel assembly evokes a diagram of volumes, where cabbage, pepper, eggplant and onions are considered for their respective proportions, as segregated containers or protective shells. This morphological operation is balancing between order and anarchy, with an attention to textures and nuances, reducing the components to skin of effect and power, as garment for the insurgent model. Furthermore, the imagined interior is subdivided in meiosis, borrowing from the biological to form a mechanical beast, simultaneously custodian and mutinous, both legume and legend. A study unearthing strata of geological formations serves as the point of departure for terraforming. This collection of crust seems to shed light on the differentiated nature of these badlands. Configurations of craters, alluvial soils, Heavy indentations and fault zones establish a narrative of formal mimesis. Replicating these organic emergences and topographical phenomena, a series of skeletal structures are manipulated, folded, depressed or inflated. Coated by the same matter, and placed among the lumps, these sculptures blend with their surroundings, indiscernible and weightless. In navigational still shots we see reptilian and tripodal robots cautiously mapping this camouflage territory. One wonders if this additive choreography, where organic and artificial batholiths are seamlessly morphing and merging, is an attempt to render the barren relief fit to occupy, or an iteration of a perpetual and compulsive undertaking to aimlessly shape an architectural layer cake. An epidermal intervention on a facade becomes an architectural exploration in displaying the effect of aggression. A regular metallic armature protrudes from the surface of the building, transforming the flat plane into a three-dimensional shield. The punctual fortification holds foggy grids of different opacities, with oval openings like military arrow slits, of different sizes. Undulated matter is grafted around the outlines of existing apertures, further narrowing their visibility from the outside. Distinct pikes with sharp steel heads rupture this outwork, obtruding and threatening. A final layer of pipe systems incorporating vital resources is added to enhance the ornamental camouflage effect of this rampart of complexity. Behind the thickness of this projected anxiety lies an interstitial space of reflection, where, sandwiched between the opposing mirrored skins, one can glance at the sky. Dark and indistinguishable with ease, the sublimated edifice befits a bastion of survival, a prototype adorned by flying doves, as if beatified.
On a land covering a steep hill, a religious domain comprising a convent and a farm is subject to an experimental transposition. First, the architect analyzes the terrain with cartographic precision, locating points of influence in a strategic network of interventions. Then, converted to a virologist with a military eye, the attention is turned to the site constituents. Electric poles, cables, antennas and scaffoldings are scrutinized and transformed. In a revengeful manner, the usually disregarded is reconfigured into onerous vessels that impose heating. Repositioned, these invigorated cybertransplants practice overwatch. The operational diagnosis reaches the constructed heart of the estate, where buildings are treated with the same motif of malicious rearrangement. Amid natural green growth, these organisms of monstrous sophistication are uprooted and weaponized to complete conquest. Here, committed overlays of defensive and menacing obstructions perform like a topographical berm, from which drones embark to fulfill missions beyond the borders of the initial given stretch. The grotesque is utilized as an alibi for creation, to evoke images of hostile takeovers and horrifying strategies of occupation. With combinatory experimentation, the architect turns into an alchemist. The integration of mechanical and electronic components, with feedback, transforms insects into cyborgs. This exoteric transmutation expands the nature of these organisms by increasing their abilities. It reframes prosthetics as an extension of the body, rather than mere replacement. Galvanized into action, they convert into remote-controlled chimeras or autonomous miniature drones. Yet, these manipulations manifest a larger research into complex architectonic systems. Previous bionic augmentations are increased in size, revealing insectile hordes, morphogenetically modified to be inhabitable by humans. As hydroids they can submerge in seas, equipped with decks and periscopes. As aerials, they can swarm over cities, inducing territorial relationships in situ. The architect here returns with a demonstration, from an ingeminated perversion into a magnified upgrade, from scape to scope.
This project delves into the coalescent, in an attempt to assimilate and celebrate viscosity. A photographic analysis of a caramelized toffee block leads to a formal repertoire of detected stains that, once isolated, are categorized to be filtered and reinterpreted as outlandish prospection. Sets of these consolidated three-dimensional traces seem to share anatomical characteristics with myriapods. Elongated, metameric, with numerous leg-bearing segments, antennas or tentacles, these compositions are reminiscent of centipedes, urchins, seahorses, insects and other genera that appear transfixed like patterns in discontinued movement. Assigned a limpid skin that echoes the sticky consistency of the syrup source, these derivatives are blended to form different compounds. Views showcase these fusions as lava eruptions and curling collisions, like a journey through progressive ripples led by a troglodyte figure. The traveler is undaunted by these turbulences, as if creating them himself. This wandering protagonist revels in these spectral scenes of morphogenesis, like a hermit in his seclusion, or a deity over a temple. Absorbing the reflections of this immersive setting, the barbed silhouette seems to be complementary to each sequence it traverses, as if summoning space with every step. Hence, the whole is an expansive funnel that concludes in portals, beyond which it perpetually regenerates, transitory and recurring. A space excavation into the ossified tectonic plates of some newly discovered planet reveals an abandoned underworld. Infused with mystery through the use of holographic low-angle shots, this apparent glacier is suspected to be previously inhabited. Plodding through with conventional movement seems to be insufficient. Here, one must climb, glide or crouch on crystallized surfaces, only sidestepping between aimless meditation and fighting monstrous entities, or figments, perhaps. Documented with archaeological precision, these presented cartographies unearth a totemic shelter, structured as an agglomerate of hierarchical sectors of activity. In sequences of transition, spaces are articulated by spherical junctions and accented tunnels. These suspended topographical rifts turn up as events in an otherwise barren cavernous chasm. Floating slabs are barely held by an erratic structure. Almost thawing out, superimposed platforms appear to dissolve into one another. A patina work, variably coating the span of a block, drips with pointed icicle formations from each of the levels, like stalactites hanging from the cave's ceiling. It is these molded deposits that extend to support the piling of the planes. Scanned and simplified, this ornamental milfoil is virtually remodeled to decode the object's convoluted logic. Essentially resolved as a binary system of wire meshes, woven coarse surfaces bend, tangle and twist, continuously warping the regular grids of the horizontals. This three-dimensional infiltration results in extensive moving sections, which elucidate many interesting spatial accidents. These episodes, that reflect natural phenomena, are rendered as artificial barrier islands, delimiting fantastical lagoons in a mystical grotto. Here in limbo, the damned meets the pure in duel. A translucent resin block is congealing clots of folded matter and spurts of gel paste into a complex formation of latex foam, similar to an exquisite corpse. Crinkles, cloudy blobs and overlapping tentacles appear harmoniously crumpled. X-rayed features are represented with scribbled segments, vertices and meshes. This formal research allows the isolation of these coagulates, beyond the physical model. Changing the materiality of the result induces clever interdependence and divergent associations. Views on a white canvas reveal the scale of the rough carrion, where exaggerated spikes and peaks articulate the cavities with surfaces. From a decaying state to a living setting, this darkly dramatized exoskeleton is transposed onto a new block, a residential one. Upon this wasteland, it violently collides with the facades and bridges the buildings together. Fluctuating between deterioration and enhancement, this scheme attempts to disrupt the suburban experience by suggesting gateways to different realms between reality and science fiction.
A graphic research in mineral formations is a recipe for architectural speculation. Beyond the object, stratified resin matter is carefully dissected, exposing truncated sections of chromatic nuances and microtextures. Splatters and creases form noise patterns and interferences that channel into different readings, allowing new and singular development of space with differentiated cavities. This deployment of thicknesses, in which both accumulated and dynamic energy flows are contained, unwraps a cavernous porosity that has the potential of occupation. Wireframe diagrams of a sculpted single mesh are solidified to represent a ghostly set in the making. Without clear distinction between interior and exterior spaces, these continuous surfaces ostensibly envelop droplets of programs, drenched in white, gold and quicksilver coatings, that attribute preciosity to the airy whole. This delicate gilding of alloy emits reflections that merge the mineral with the organic in a molten fusion, triggering a loss of limits. A topomorphic mirage unveils fleeting images of displaced and misplaced confluences, such as liquefied mountains, frozen deserts, mercurial dunes and vaporous valleys. Unfazed by the dissolution of boundaries, travelers roam this eclectic field of mutation, following a cloud on the horizon, where everything is interpenetrating and in constant state of transfer. These sceneries of entanglement, too refined to be ghastly and hostile, seem to be fit for renegades off to anti-gravitational escapades, in a vast ethereal dreamscape.
In a future where the surface of the Earth is no longer inhabitable, architecture as we know it is obsolete. This hypothesis impels the architect to flee into the deep sea, positing a futuristic venture that could accommodate and ensure the survival of his species. Inspired by microorganisms of the seabed, parameterized nerves and webs emerge like stalagmites from the abyssal plain. Multiplied, this hydrophilic bubble colony acts as a spawning field for embryos anticipating new beginnings. Sheltering from this anoxic environment, merging bulbs create a suitable microclimate in which bean-shaped capsules are tied together, organically resembling a renal system. Sections and views reveal the entrails of these Rossworm-like spatial concoctions, rendered as a complex network of pods, floating within bioluminescent tunics. Motile, with a hierarchy of compact heads to loose flagella, some agglomerates can detach from the coral reef and become planktonic totems that set out on discovery missions coursing for conquest. Assigned natural attributes and mimicking ecosystems, this imagined Ascidian urbanism seems to foreshadow further anthropogenic cataclysms, in the most vast dwelling of the planet, the ocean. Voided shells, shadowy ruins and fissured buildings, or what is left of them, populate this proposed static dystopian world. The familiarity of these fragments evoke a normative diorama, related to our known conventions. Completely destroyed and abandoned, displayed as a backdrop where these collapsed structures now become remnants of loss. Out of the rubble, appear meticulously crafted gizmos, different and detailed, relating part to part within themselves, as memorial mechanics. Their otherness seems to derive from devised principles, technologically advanced and active logics of engagement, yet, their augmented scale is still human. Instrumental, some fetter onto the remains, hovering with assertion. Others maneuver around with contention. Are these operations of rescue, discovery, or colonization? Were they in fact the reason for the outbreak of destruction? As we fail to place them in time, these scenes keep oscillating between improvement and catastrophe. The potent image of the power plant is readdressed in a biomechanical age. Here, the pod leaves the frame and becomes an inhabitable blob. Propelled from its industrial container, the object, on its own, can levitate over the landscape unencumbered by hardware. It forms a transitory living bulb out on a mission. Its interiority, although compartmented, reveals an anti-gravitational space, where the inhabitant himself can circulate freely, guided by his curiosity. The perforations in the shell and protruding oculi imply it is looking outward. This viral station, like a surveillance weapon, is launched from a cylindrical smoke screen, involute, as if birthed by it. Swift, clandestine and stealthy. A viral station presented as a reversed excrescence in an urban fabric, becomes an emblem of survival, tucked in the depth of a contaminated territory. Relying on the aesthetic of prosthetics, with surgical measures of accumulation, molding and merging, this withering outgrowth conceals a series of spaces in disguise, unsuspected from the outside. In fact, this industrial figure is placed into abyss, occupying a voided pit in a desolate train station, undetected. Patella and connectors, splices and bridges, intrinsic to the biomechatronic nature of this hatch, enable survivors to elude epidemics, as a transfer platform, or a base of operations. Beyond the specifics of its functional rationale, this ergonomic body appears to be designed as an added limb, in the foundations of the city.
A carburetor sorts itself out, to mature into an inkling of architecture. Effortlessly stripped from its outer structure, in an act of morphing, the heavy and vapid becomes light and smart, almost liquefied. With a play on scale, all possibilities could be considered: an inhabitable place with different quarters or other bubbles of activity, advanced remote sensing ships, or devices, or even flying self-sufficient alien breeds. Here, you uncannily linger, pottering into infinite strata of layers, between outside and inside. Although identifiable in form, they seem to derive from the same point of conception, where space is cerebral, appearing singular in surface, yet concealing intricate woven strands of intelligence and communication.
At the heart of this city, the clock tower doesn't strike midnight. Hacked and weaponized by its caretaker, an act of piracy from within, the clock tower strikes defiant energies, with centrifugal forces targeting the neighboring government-built belt. This symbolic pole of civic communion becomes a significant pièce de résistance in the fight against the prevailing police state. The eye of the clock conceals a turbine apparatus that launches ligatures, violating the fenestration grids of surrounding establishments, and creating a network of infiltration. These beams, rendered red, are trusses of support and peripheral transfer junctions that proclaim change and repeal. Halted at the construction phase, an incomplete structure stands derelict, neglected and unused in an ever-changing urban context. Intrigued by its presence, yet unable to enter, the architect reads the exterior facade of the built condition, listing the apparent architectonic components. These emerge as the sole tools that enable him to reconstruct the shell, in an attempt to imagine its interior. Through a series of iterations, each visible part is shifted and rotated, multiplied and stacked, reconvened in different relational elucidations to explore different outcomes. The governing rule of this methodology is reflecting the constraint of access, by transforming the hermetic into an open-ended and transparent system. Structural columns and beams are reduced to scaffoldings, walls turn into slabs, metallic trusses become ornamental bracings, and staircases merge, often gliding and leading nowhere. All seem to propose a vertical labyrinth, romanticized and surreal, indisposed to satisfy reason, in persistently impossible positions. This obsessive exercise in failure is reinforcing the stance that the physical built environment is stripped of meaning, if unexperienced. This experimentation is considering a post-human world, where artificial intelligence has taken over. Conventional X-rays, documenting the anatomy of a human body today, are issued as outdated and irrelevant in this proposed future. If found by a sentient machine as peculiar registers, could they then be analyzed and assessed? Could a human soma be entirely restituted and understood by using a database of these same documents? The proposal seems to simulate this premise in an AI laboratory, in search for answers. Tomography scans of a skull are treated as structural plans, placed together in chronological succession, based on their different guising characteristics. Color-coded and superimposed, extruded in discrete axes, they start to outline partitions and enclaves, defining volumes of porosity, prone to reassembly. However, when these serial sections are put together in distinct order, they lose their human specificity, and start referring to various organisms. With a balancing act of additive formal reconfiguration and bioengineering, new species emerge. By changing the taxonomy of arrangement, these creatures change in shape, size and function. From monopods, to bipods, to blobs, the alien Frankenstein doctors transcend Earthlings, and depict mechanical drones that align with their culture.
An intervention on an elevator shaft conveys an experience of vertigo. Extruded upwards, the circulation battery bursts out of the residential block it serves, erecting as an autonomous beacon. Once stretched, the claustrophobic box is intersected with chromatic vectors. Upright and tilted translucent beams are ungrounded and multidirectional, in complete contrast with the rigid receptacle they emanate from. Exploded and abstracted, these spheres turn into evasive platforms that hover with inexplicable lightness. This project is an imaginative catharsis of an aversion to containment. Through this operation of diversion, an introverted irrational fear becomes an extroverted celebration of freedom. Eclectic and elegant.
A shield for riots is designed as an urban installation, meant to receive assaulted civilians and victims of brute force. This vertical street partition can graft onto buildings using brackets that deploy like mechanical arms for stability. A single main wall, equipped with stairs and ladders, acts as a protective facade, concealing first aid stations, pockets of safety and observation decks. This logistical cage can also participate, with subversive tactics, in the confrontations, blurring the line between mediator and activist, border and watchtower. This instrument of support amplifies the voice of the people, suppressing danger at times, and enhancing their uproar at others. Accelerated scientific and technological progress propels us onto anxious states of constant anticipation, perhaps today more than ever, because whatever or however we define it, the future is now. Recent fields of enterprise towards ontological and ideological changes are of significance, yet, the dismal scaffolding of our being, death, seems to be too empirically grounded to dismiss. For a networked society, where nomadism is the dominant social drive, vessels of death become neo-sarcophaguses, scientized, where conscience and memory are preserved. Ironically, perhaps the hosts themselves died by computerization, but once fitted inside these hulls they are satisfied by transspatial voyages. They jump cut between reality and virtuality, between life and afterlife in dual nature, just like Schrödinger's cat, never condensing into one of its possible statuses.
On the operating table are prosaic objects that were once filled with meaning by the ever-expanding imagination of a curious child, to whom everything is a toy. These objects are scrutinized, maniacally competing for attention, as child play recedes, allowing the architectural experimentation to begin. Decorticated and dismantled, their anatomy is disclosed with decisiveness and accuracy. Once deconstructed, every fragment is again subject to a series of actions: cut, fold, rotate and scale, in a meticulous study of reconfiguration. What is compelling in this patchwork is the lack of hierarchy and economy. Once these items are disassembled, everything is treated equally with every detail providing as many possibilities as the next. These bits are then reassembled to create a self-contained reality in refraction. Scattered and woven over the city, these composites reveal surprising associations between the most incomparable things. Through this poetic ecstasy of small things, from micro to mega, the digital made personal becomes public. A block of debris is presented solitary and singular, as if salvaged from wreckage and recovered for record, as an object of value. As one's eye, fascinated by this sculpture of decay, starts navigating its many textures and colors, filling the cavities with untold stories, one starts to discern familiar artifacts. Melted lead and perforated metal sheets, rusted sanitary pipes and electric cables, are just a few among this amalgam of industrial objects, condensed to form this decrepitude. Not only as intractable as the passage of time but also as arbitrary as the alphabetical order. It all unfolds, in true Transformer style, uncovering sentient monopods, unbound rovers and flying mechanical spears, where every piece is shaped, particularly determined and purposeful. The still object of value becomes globe-trotting sentinels of valor, roaming an eerily dim, post-mechanistic junkyard.
With an evolutionary undertaking, a tight framework is disrupted by directional bends that distort the otherwise repetitive columns and rows. These corruptions provoke swellings that inflate the lines much like infective agents leech onto a host, multiplying and in turn, overlapping each other and metastasizing. Iterating this viral parameter of growth reverses the void ratio, completely damaging the consistency of the initial table of cells, injecting it with transformative geometries of expansive free-formed shells. Beyond the matrix, these ever-growing blobs seem to spill past borders, becoming fluctuating data totems. There, luscious structures of fractals conceal meandering tunnels that contract and enlarge, dilute and concentrate in symmetric palliative cohesion, frolicking with ideas of urban densification. This exercise in congestion exorcises pollution. An exhibit of metaphysical equilibrium via devious yet immersive spaces takes us from measurable sprawl to sprawl in the incorporeal. A futuristic weapon of ambush is displayed in this experiment. Similar to a malware in the digital age, materialized, it can infiltrate any war-torn vestige, hacking its structure. Once deployed, the liquefied substance solidifies into intersecting vertices and smudges of textures that stain a spatial host, transforming it. This territorial avatar relies on mapping systems to create phantasmagoric environments. The siege body generates formation facilities, where the initial space is readapted as a military staging area or a simulator, in which theories and situations of warfare can be tested and refined, without the need for actual hostilities and casualties, other than architectural. Here, the natural and artificial are inextricably entwined in a model of invasion, to develop new tactics that condition human involvement and performance by abstraction. From splash camouflage to flash action, this stratagem turns improvised explosive devices into exuberant transplants of refurbishments. Similar to a bone section, an alveolar model inspires an intervention at the core of a residential building. Breaking and replacing slabs with contrasting single surfaces that act like cartilage in a phantom body, this ghost infiltration is designed as an extended tubular volume. The wire mesh bridges through the edifice, from the ground to the roof, ossifying in the middle, becoming its structural spinal cord. At certain levels, this mutated tissue pierces the facade, forming calcified protrusions of alternative scale that redefine the external envelope of the mass. On the inside, visual perspectives unify the space, in all directions. Bits of residual solids from the process, hang and animate the crystalline interiors, allowing the hybrid and mystified volute to be traversed and experienced. Navigating through the cavities of this cavernous superspace transcribes and engrosses visitors in a museographic promenade of spectral proportions. By use of the photocopy machine, the human body is presented and represented, fragmented and mutilated. These visuals intertwine hair with skin, and eyes with torso, and face with feet, with lips and hair and teeth, and nails again and again, in an endless suture of confusion. This provocative dance looks like a celebration of the human figure, but it turns out to be an active research in perverted disembodiment. It places these members in succession, then jump cuts and displaces frames in Baroque fashion, evoking a carnal collage where reconstruction by memory is unlikely, and amnesia impossible. Treated only as surface, distorted, flattened and reduced to an orgy of textures and waves, organs are reshaped, multiplied and transformed into an interactive corporality to host life from the outside rather than the inside. This free shift in dimensions is utilized once more, with an unhinging yet intriguing rendition. This premise resorts to escapism by means of blasting all familiar aspects, making them float in cosmos, becoming an auto-cannibalistic ritual where the corpus is confronted to the expanding abyss of space. The outbreak of the Civil War left part of the Beirut city center damaged. What remained was a tangle of rusting girders and broken concrete, pocked with bullet holes, dubbed the Egg. One of the last remnants of a lost era, in a completely rebuilt central district. This iconic post-war structure is considered a receptacle of memory that, maintaining its current state and status, overlooks the revived city. Disturbing this relation, the design utilizes a causative process of sketching that deploys itself from the relic. In abstraction, the scribbles seem to outline an angel figure with folded wings, perhaps that of history, which turns its back on the new, and embraces the old. Projected from, yet, attached to the open facade of the eggshell, it creates an enclosure, as if transfixing time in a space of perpetual recollection. With this addition, the architect attempts to transcend the original vocation of the space, from a conventional cinema auditorium, into an immersive VR portal. Such face-off, with similar materiality, roughness and porosity, has an eerie mirroring effect. Uncanny, it becomes an unresolved prosthetic that feeds on collective emotion. This phantom limb of retention, like a banshee, levitates, but does not alleviate. A neighborhood communal church is subject to an experimentation wherein the invisible is manifested. Like a holographic appearance, almost metaphysical, the floating structure is an aerial replica that overlaps the space of worship, transfigured to be transcended. The intangible essence of devotion is physically interpreted, perhaps reflecting the souls of the pilgrims, in a state of trance. Bridges and pathways disrupt the mass of the blob, hung above praying bodies like an open invitation on a sacred journey towards spiritual realization. Strolling through the belly of the suspended entity, heathens confront their inner psyche, aligned with their divine associations, in new rituals of disbelief. In this spectral investigation of alternative possibilities, the cultural is made cultic, advocating a syncretic future. 64 scribbles of laced arrangements are categorized and listed in chromatic families. Bound together by splutters of translucent matter, they start to attach and knit molecular structures, as if caught in a performance of transmutation. Maintaining their logics of accumulation, they reveal interesting connections of partial assembly. Their construction appears comparable to a biological makeup. One can discern a specific directional anatomy of intent, yet they remain cynical and incomplete. Throughout the process, we can distinguish a genealogy of characteristics, a script that showcases generations out of which the architect designates a queen. This chosen entity is a mothership, assigned for production, leading and protecting the cyber herd. With monitoring functions and impetus flight, this insectobot creates, releases and tracks bitumen-like viral substances. The now tamed 64 drawings can generate 100 conquering synthetic drones. A personal home studio becomes the source and subject of a particular architectural venture. Through sonic orchestration, wherein the effects of echo, reverb and delay are used as influential force parameters of physical morphing, the room is altered, mushed to an inverted mushroom upgraded downwards. Mimicking the produced sound, threads and jolts of particles are shaped and inflated. They expand in ether only to be solidified. With additive modeling manipulations, these forms are mapped, multiplied and scaled to outgrow the capsule they sprung from. Superimposed, similar to layers in a musical track, they form a coherent entity that, once amplified, envelops its receptacle, unbound and sustained, dismissive of its duration or playtime. Roaming through the unleashed ambient field of frequencies, like released notes oscillating on smooth surfaces and dissipating through intertwined vessels, one can snake and twist in a continuous spatial choreography. This synthesis of architecture and acoustics is a systemic yet poetic search for balance between the tactile and the abstract, like a virtuosic solo after a looping chord progression. A photographic manipulation allows a glimpse of a casual image before it becomes faint, similar to a scroll through the matrix, from virtual to real to virtual again. The glass thickness, blurring the border between exterior and interior, is subject to a reading and intervention in favor of a third condition. This self-portrait, taken from a reflection, is filtered, rendering the lit sections of the image with a dense framework, almost opaque. This glitch in transition affects the underlit sections where dark shadows are partitioned, in haphazard fashion. The regular grid is tessellated by discrepant overlapping honeycomb forms, more transparent, making it the only remaining recognizable part of the original image. The interface cleared, negative spaces implode to form three-dimensional vertex figures. These asymmetrical cellulations offset inwardly, turning the voids they maintained into solid fills, and vice versa. The results are truncated multi-headed formations resembling crystal clusters. Augmented and stretched, the coated structures appear and disappear with a play of reflections, inhabited by these same reconfigured traces that now drift like drones, in an ethereal, almost hallucinatory atmosphere.
Revisiting ancient city vestiges, a series of typological and topological maps is traced and logged. Ruins of habitats formed by stone walls turn into components, taken apart only to be reconfigured. Through an iterative process, a new script is written, delving into readapted systems. With an allocated pit, a spatial anchor recording the passage of time, the ruins are rotated, mirrored and multiplied. Contingent, this rhizomic process is sustained and intensified, with undiscerned coherence. Analogous to a eulogy of multiplicity, seeming to originate from a do resuscitate order, blown out of proportion. Ritualistic and transcendental, from solid ruins to microconstructs, to metastructures. In a play of role reversal, the architect becomes a surgeon operating on the medical facility itself. The subject of this performance is the equipment that services typical nursing rooms. The adjustable bed, the heart rate monitor and the serum stand are dismantled and analyzed with a thrilling reinterpretation. Features and fragments are enhanced, scaled, disfigured and regenerated to take part in a theatrical psychodrama, transgressing the stage, the wings and all existing apparatuses, to the rumination and pleasure of the patient's turned audience. The usually hidden cables and functional aid arms are exposed and transfixed. The curtain partitions are solidified blood banks, embedded with new oversized capsules and gizmos. Everything here seems intensively anomalous, sharpened and mollified, desterilized and infectious. Fluctuating between inertia and dementia, This pathological refurnishing of the hospital space makes it almost inhospitable, a nightmarish representation of what would happen if all the undeclared worries and suppressed distress of visiting patients were to be articulated and actualized, purging them and the setting of uneasiness by facing it fearlessly.